Remedy Entertainment are most well known for developing the Max Payne games. Max Payne 1 was a gritty third-person shooter where you played as an undercover cop with nothing to lose, waging a war against New York City's criminal underworld with the backdrop of a record-breaking blizzard. It popularized the whole bullet time mechanic in gaming, which is something that's since become commonplace. Max Payne 2 replaced the snow with rain and took the gameplay in a bit of a different direction, turning Max's bullet time skill into a reality-defying ability, where he could move faster and break the laws of physics. Now, people argue over which game is the best, but I think most people are going to agree that they're two awesome titles, and it cemented Remedy as a developer that knew what the hell they were doing when it came to third-person shooters. In 2010, Remedy tried something a little bit different though with Alan Wake. Written by Sam Lake, who was responsible for giving the Max Payne series its unique tone and writing, Alan Wake was a bit of a departure from their film noir-inspired hard-boiled detective story. Set in the Pacific Northwest instead of New York, and inspired by TV shows like Twin Peaks delivered as episodic content, with each episode of the game ending with plot twists and cliffhangers. It was originally developed for the Xbox 360 in 2010, but got a re-release on PC in 2012, which is the version I'm taking a look at. And it's definitely one of the most unique games ever made and does a pretty good job of juggling the narrative with the gameplay, also with an incredible soundtrack to boot. People have been asking me to take a look at this thing for ages, and it's a game that I've just never gotten around to doing a video on, despite the fact I've played and finished it probably a dozen times.
Excuse me, I need to take this.
The setup to the story is pretty simple. You play as the eponymous Alan Wake, an author retreating to the town of Bright Falls in Washington with his wife Alice to try and cure himself of his writer's block. They're barely in town long enough to smell the pine wood before things go horribly wrong though, and Alice is kidnapped by some kind of evil presence.
Oh no!
Alan blacks out and wakes up a week later with no recollection of events prior. Then you're on a mission to rescue Alice and figure out what the hell has happened.
I couldn't remember how I got there. All I knew was that something terrible had happened to Alice.
Without trying to spoil too much, at the heart of the story is the Dark Presence, a mysterious supernatural force that's taken over Bright Falls and is slowly infecting its citizens. As you'd kind of expect, Alan spends a pretty significant portion of the game just trying to convince everyone else of the threat, whilst always seemingly having to flee from the Dark Presence in the many forms it takes. And this is one of the many similarities between the game and Twin Peaks. For starters, both the game and the TV series are set in logging towns, and they also reference a darkness that's haunted the town for generations. In Twin Peaks, the story kicks off after the mysterious murder of Laura Palmer. In Alan Wake, it's the disappearance of Alan's wife, the catalyst for both plots being a woman. Then Twin Peaks has a crazy log lady, and Alan Wake has a crazy lamp lady.
You got lucky this time, young man. You can hurt yourself in the dark.
There's also references to the Twilight Zone and Stephen King. Alan outright talks about King on numerous occasions, and the opening shot flying above the mountains looks exactly like the same shot from the opening of the Shining film. And then one character is named Pat Maine, Maine being where Stephen King lives.
Oh no!
Then of course, Alan Wake's name is an anagram, a very important one. See, when you rearrange the letters, you get weak anal. Think about it. In terms of the supporting cast, you've got Alan's manager and buddy Barry, voiced by the same guy who voiced Vinnie Gognitti in Max Payne 2.
Hey, nobody move! Get your hands off of my client!
Who are you?
I'm Barry Wheeler, his agent.
You fucking pay for this Russian, you fucking pay!
Then you've got the local sheriff, Sarah Breaker, who's a bit more inclined to believe Alan's stories due to her own history with the area. To go too much further into the story though would be a bit of a sin, because coming across all of these developments is what makes Alan Wake so much fun to play. It's really like you're binging out on some kind of TV show just back to back, where you can't wait to hit that next episode button and keep the ball rolling.
Stay right where you are, Slade!
I think my only issue is that the story is very exposition heavy. There's never any question about a character's motives or the meanings and going-ons with every intricacy of the plot. The game's gonna literally spell out every single facet of the story that we need to know. We don't really come across these facts on our own, and cinematics are heavy with dialogue that explains each and every little thing.
The loose sheets of paper were pages from a manuscript entitled Departure. That was the name I planned to use for the next novel I had never gotten started.
You don't really have to worry about missing some kind of metaphor or something symbolic going over your head. You almost half expect certain characters to start running through what they had for breakfast that day, or their favourite TV show, or their thoughts on foreign trade routes. Each chapter always ends with something pretty huge happening, and then the ensuing chapter starts off with Alan narrating the events of the prior chapter to get you back up to speed.
Previously on Alan Wake.
This kind of works in the format and the style the game is going for, but it also works just when you're playing the game because it has clear-cut stop and start points, and it helps if you want to take a break and go out and see some sunlight. The problem is that some of the voice acting is a bit average, and the animation during the cinematics can seem pretty odd, and some of the facial animations just look bad. Like Alice, for instance, looks like she fell out of the ugly tree and hit all of the branches on the way down, along with getting her face stung by bees. Even Alan pulls these really weird faces at times, which isn't what you want to see from your main character. Overall, it's pretty well told stuff and just what you'd expect from Sam Lake and the team at Remedy, who know how to put a good story together. It's even got the return of those very odd meta TV shows, similar to Address Unknown and Lords and Ladies from Max Payne 2.
Tonight's episode, a quantum suicide.
This whole scenario of Bright Falls and its mysterious history makes the whole thing pretty compelling. It's a good combination of drama, thriller, horror, and even comedy.
Might as well get some rest. And by rest, I mean drunk.
Come on, Barry, this is... Yeah, what the hell?
The main enemies you come up against are the Taken. Now these are ordinary people that have been infected by the Dark Presence and pretty much just want to murder Alan on sight. These are just normal looking people like fishermen, loggers and so forth, but all of them usually wield some kind of blunt or sharp object and they're all super pissed off. How you kill these guys is simple. You shine a flashlight on them or a flare to remove the Dark Presence, which then makes them vulnerable and you can finish them off with the revolver, shotgun or the hunting rifle. Yeah, we don't have time to look for cures or any of that shit. We're just killing these guys straight up. Serves them right for being possessed. When an enemy winds up for an attack and you're about to get hit, you can press shift to dodge, and if you time this thing right, it goes all slow motiony for a bit, showing Alan suavely ducking out of the way. Now, there is a bit of variety to these guys in the sense that some enemies are faster than others, some enemies can throw projectiles and others can hit you with combos. But the only real major difference is the amount of time you need to shine a light at them before you can actually kill them. If you press the right mouse button, Alan focuses his flashlight, which removes the darkness from enemies quicker. Now, I don't know how this really makes sense considering doing this runs out your batteries in seconds, and as far as I know, that's not how flashlights in real life work. But it does come in handy when the game starts throwing 4, 5 or even 6 enemies at you at once, and you start feeling like someone who drew the short straw in the center of this violent gangbang.
Fuck you!
You can also set off a flare, which can be used to ward off a bunch of enemies at a time. You can hold onto this thing until it burns out or drop it on the ground. Then there's also a flare gun, which is the game's version of a grenade launcher, able to kill a cluster of the Taken in a single hit. Bigger sized enemies almost kind of constitute as mini boss fights, and they require a fair bit of light before they're vulnerable. Then on top of that, they're going to need way more hits to take down. In between all of this, you've got light sources to refill your health and get much needed checkpoints, just to keep in line with the whole light and dark theme the game's going for. It's easy to say that the combat is repetitive, and on the surface it kind of is, but there is the option to mix things up here with the combos of weaponry, the flares and the flashbangs. So I think it's about as repetitive as you let it be. You'll come across better flashlights throughout the campaign, which make this process of shining light on enemies a little bit less tedious. But the core gameplay loop will still be the same. It's up to the player how they try to shake it up a bit. Still, I gotta say, the shooting is incredibly visceral and it really looks cool how it goes all slow motiony when you start killing something. Or when you throw out a flashbang and obliterate 4 or 5 enemies at once, it's really satisfying. It's a combination of good-looking particle effects and punchy, hard-hitting weapons. They've done a really good job with the sound design too, like the way the Taken mutter and ramble to themselves makes it really unsettling. And the fact these guys can kill you in 3 or 4 hits means they're an actual threat at times.
Premium cabins for rent in...
Oh, hell.
The difficulty modes mostly affects the amount of time you've got to shine your light on these guys, along with how many shots it's going to take to actually kill them. I kind of don't like this though, only because it seems like an artificial way of making the enemies tougher. And also what's interesting is that the difficulty modes are titled differently on the PC, with normal mode being actually hard mode and hard mode being nightmare difficulty. and this can be confusing at first when you think you're playing on normal mode, but getting your ass handed to you by these asshole hicks. The only real thing I don't like about the combat, outside of how repetitive it can feel at times, is how there's no crosshair. Instead, the flashlight serves as the next best thing. You just kind of have to point your flashlight in the general direction of an enemy and the auto-aim does the rest. But it removes any real sense of accuracy to the shooting, and headshots also make absolutely no difference. This is in stark contrast to the Max Payne games where accuracy was always rewarded, and headshots became essential. Alan Wake definitely feels like a bit of a step down in terms of the shooting mechanics. I blame this on the Xbox 360 more than anything else. There's also certain moments in the game that are just some good old-fashioned bullshit. At one point, someone at Remedy ran out of enemy ideas, so instead what they start doing is throwing the furniture at you. Literally. You've got to deal with trailers, wheelbarrows, and barrels that come to life and get flung at you by the darkness. Honestly, the idea of fighting inanimate objects is just so lame. This is about as fun as waxing your asshole. There's a boss fight in the game which is just a possessed bulldozer, and later on you'll do the same against a harvester. And in case you're wondering, a boss fight against a possessed vehicle, it ain't all that great. I also don't like these possessed ravens, or swoopy boys as we call them in Australia. These just fly around and swoop at you, and you've just got to shine your torch on them over and over to finally cause them to all dissipate. It's just annoying. Plus they reuse this so many times throughout the campaign. I think you honestly come up against these feathered pricks a dozen or so times. The absolute worst bit by far though is where they take away all of your weapons, and then just throw like 7 or 8 enemies on top of you at once. This bit only lasts a few minutes, but it is so unenjoyable that it almost made me rage quit and uninstall the game. At the end of every single chapter, the game takes away all of your weapons and items too. So all of that careful resource management you might have done, like hoarding away your flare gun ammo or your flashbangs, it means absolutely nothing. This is the downside to a game that relies so heavily on its narrative. It does make sense in terms of the story that Alan's not going to hold on to half a dozen flares and grenades, as he goes off and converses with the other characters. But in terms of the gameplay, it's really frustrating to have the game almost kind of wipe your progress. One part in the game they take all your weapons away, and all you can do is try to hold off the taken while this NPC shoots them with a revolver. And I mean honestly, I think I could fire a gun better in real life than this stupid asshole does. Now the reasons he has the gun and you don't makes sense in terms of the story, but it's just not fun from a gameplay perspective. It's probably my least favourite sequence in the entire game. And these are the kind of reasons why I don't think Alan Wake is a masterpiece. I mean, it is a really good game. It's downright fantastic at times. But these kind of moments are really frustrating and disappointing, and they hold it back from being the kind of timeless experience that the Max Payne games are. Still, you can expect this game to take you on one hell of a ride. And always when you think things are calming down and they're running out of ideas, they still manage to think up some new way to draw you back in. I still think this is a great looking game too. The moments during combat when the dark presence is around has a real sense of foreboding and dread, with the visuals almost going monochromatic, and the sound design really helping to heighten the atmosphere. There's just something about spooky forests at night time that's always going to look impressive, no matter how old the engine is. Remedy have always had this kind of knack for making their game worlds look true to life. You can go back and play Max Payne 2 for instance, and some of the areas in that with this razor sharp texture work still looks amazing. I think Alan Wake isn't quite as sharp as that, which is probably the result of it being released on the consoles, but stylistically it still holds up. The way the lighting changes when you pop a flare and the take and recoil from the brightness combined with the smoke and the particle effects, like it's artistic shit. And then there's the music, my god. Son, the music. Aside from just the atmospheric stuff during gameplay, there's a few licensed tracks that play throughout the campaign by Finnish band Poets of the Fall. These guys composed one of the main themes for Max Payne 2, another song called Late Goodbye. Here in Alan Wake, there's 2 awesome tracks they've done. One's called The Poet and the Muse. The lyrics for this one playing a big part in helping Alan overcome the darkness.
Okay.
Then the other one is called Children of the Elder God, which sounds like Black Sabbath and AC/DC had a baby.
God damn.
This appears in game during one of the most awesome scripted sequences, perhaps like ever, where you're holding out against waves of the Taken during your very own rock concert. This whole sequence is so fucking cool, it's just hard to fully convey how erect I was.
God damn.
And you know what? When you experience these sequences, you'll forget all of the problems the game has, which is really the biggest takeaway. Yeah, it's not a perfect game, but it just does so many things right, that the few times it gets something wrong, it almost doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things. I always remember Alan Wake being a super long game to finish, but each time I replay it, it seems to get shorter and shorter. Playing through it again for this video and taking my time took me about 5 hours to finish, and that was with going around and collecting all of the side stuff and taking my time to find all the hidden items. The original ending is a bit abrupt and it didn't really clear things up all that well, so they eventually brought out 2 extra episodes as DLC, which served as an attempt to wrap things up. The thing is, these 2 episodes aren't all that good. They're really just underwhelming and unpolished. They go on for about an hour each, but they're full of sloppy sequences and recycled environments. Combat is often in these really confined interior locations where you just don't get all that much room to maneuver. And early on you've got bugger all weapons, so simply staying alive is a bit of a chore. It just reeks of being rushed and lacking any kind of play testing or refinement. Plus, it doesn't even really resolve things anyway, and the fact they're now included for free as some kind of epilogue to the main campaign makes it even worse. I just don't advise playing either of these, unless you're just super bored and have to have more Alan Wake. What I can recommend playing though is American Nightmare, which came out in 2012 and is a bit of a standalone sequel of sorts to the original. At one point I'll probably do a more in-depth look at it, but let me do my best to sum up the most important aspects. So, the entire thing is set up like an episode of those Night Springs TV shows you could watch in Alan Wake, with this guy doing a bad Rod Serling impression as he narrates what's happening.
An observatory, a place for a man to witness the magnificence of the universe.
And Alan is up against his evil doppelganger, a guy named Mr. Scratch. The whole thing is set in Arizona where the darkness has now spread. So Alan has to rewrite reality by replaying the same sequence of events 3 times over, learning from his mistakes. Opinions on this thing are a bit mixed, and it's definitely not as polished as Alan Wake, but for what it is, which is a cheap little follow-up to the base game, I think it's pretty fun. There's a whole lot more combat in this thing too, and you get weapons that are ripped right out of Max Payne, with a MAC-10 submachine gun, sawn-off shotgun, and an assault rifle. Even the basic guns are more action-oriented, with an automatic pistol and a carbine rifle. On top of that, your flashlight weakens the Taken much faster, and the batteries recharge quicker too. In other words, you'll be doing a lot more shooting, and the game's gonna facilitate that. And I think the new backdrop of Arizona makes it a welcome change to running around the same looking forests over and over. And the combat is still awesome. Probably even more so now with the new weapons. It almost becomes too easy just mowing enemies down with the MAC-10 or the carbine. The only thing is that you're really just playing the same 45-minute or so long segment over and over. Each time Alan has a different crack at it to rewrite reality, so the content is pretty low. But as an addition to the base game, I think it's far more enjoyable than those crappy DLC episodes. I don't think Alan Wake is a perfect game, but the uniqueness of the story, its setting and the ideas makes it hard to not recommend to someone who's into both the horror and action shooting genres. There's very few games that have mastered that combination of storytelling balanced with engaging gameplay. Finally, Remedy. Stop buggering around with all these other games and give us Alan Wake 2.
Come here. Pretty please.